Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to note, I will be splitting my time with the member from Megantic-Laurel. Mr. Speaker, here we are again, debating what the previous member just described was an isolated incident of poor judgment at the CBC. Yet the problem is, with that argument, is that increasingly it's not simply an isolated incident of poor judgment at the CBC. It is a continual string of mismanagement, scandal, and decisions that run contrary to the best interests of Canadians. So here we are debating today a example of where the CBC made a decision not to support the strong bilingual nature of what our country is by using the homegrown talent that we have, specifically in Quebec when it comes to the French language, by contracting local talent, a Canadian public broadcaster not contracting local talent because they didn't want a Quebec accent on this podcast. How shameful is that? Yet that continues a trend of mismanagement and scandal, waste and corruption that has defined what the CBC is in our country here today. So as we debate the amendment that Conservatives have made, where we not concur in this report to send it back to further look at how what has become of the CBC is no longer representing the best interests of what Canada is. And I will note, because over the last number of months, as I've had the opportunity to be a part of the team that is leading the discussion on issues of heritage for the official opposition, we have seen time and time again, whether it's the current CEO of CBC, Catherine Tate, and her refusal. In fact, I gave her just yesterday an opportunity to make it crystal clear that she could show leadership to that organization by rejecting a bonus. She refused. She could show leadership by not accepting an exit or severance package as she departs the organization. She refused. Time and time again. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it was revealed, I would suggest accidentally, because certainly it's not something to be proud about, that there is a 497K club at the CBC. Now, for those here, they might be curious what a 497K club is. Well, it was revealed that there are more than 7 executives at CBC, Mr. Speaker, that make more than $497,000 a year. $497,000 a year. And on top of that, many, and there is nothing to suggest that it wasn't all of those executives, haven't received bonuses, of which, for the executives alone, average $71,000 per executive. Mr. Speaker, that is at a time when Canadians are hurting. Canadians are suffering. And yet it is CBC executives are given bonuses more than what the average Canadian makes in a year. Absolutely unbelievable. And it's not just me who thinks this. It's not just Conservatives who think this. Increasingly, we are seeing how the waste, the scandal, the mismanagement, and the bloat that we see in organizations like that are simply inconsistent with what Canadians want. And I would note that there was an editorial that was published in the Globe and Mail, and I'll quote the headline because I think it's worth putting on the record. And I quote, CBC President Catherine Tate's reign of air will not be soon forgotten. As a new CEO comes in to lead the CBC in January, there will be very simple questions that need to be asked, of which I would suggest at the top of the list is the need to ensure that this organization is not awarding big bonuses while cutting jobs, not seeing declining revenues, declining viewership, and declining trust, yet lowering their own what are called KPIs. And for those watching, KPIs are an acronym for what's called key performance indicators. And you know, that's what bonuses are paid out on. That's how the organization, any organization, this is something that happens in government and the private sector, but they will set targets. known as KPIs. And if you meet those targets, then there's consideration of bonuses. So when a number of years ago, CBC met only, I believe it was 3 of 14 KPIs. Well, that doesn't sound like a very good record. That doesn't sound like an organization that is being successful in its objectives. So the next year, what happened? Well, Mr. Speaker, all of a sudden, they met the majority. I believe they say that they met 11 of 14. So if you were to take a quick glance at that, many people would say, oh, that's great. They're doing fantastic. They went from 3 to 11 in a year. How there must be some incredible things that are happening. Well, until you start peeling back the layers, so to speak. And what are those layers, one might ask? Well, those layers are that the CBC, instead of improving their performance, they simply lowered their targets. And as a result, it wasn't simply that this is bar graphs and a chart that are then published that would make one suggest that maybe they're doing better than they are. That's a very small part of what these KPIs are. But rather, what that means is that the organization then recommended big taxpayer-funded fat bonuses for its managers and executives. So, Mr. Speaker, we see this trend under these Liberals, that they reward themselves for failure, yet refuse to take responsibility for what has become a series of mistakes, of mismanagement, of bloat, of paying out big dollars to those who support them in their agenda, all while Canadians suffer. And when it comes to defunding the CBC, I think increasingly Canadians are the ones that are singing this proverbial tune. They look at the bonuses and they say, that's simply not worth the cost. They look at the programming and they're simply not watching the programming. It's not like this is something that is being led by Conservatives. This is Canadians choosing to not watch CBC programming. Clear and simple. Their numbers prove it. And when it was interesting, at committee yesterday, the CEO talked about how they explained what connected TVs were and how they just recently discovered that Canadians were able to access content in diverse and different ways. But, Mr. Speaker, what is very interesting about that is Canadians aren't surprised about the way that they can access content. Canadians have been accessing a diversity of content that certainly does not line up with what the CBC offers, and increasing numbers are looking for new and creative ways to see that content. Yet, here we have the CBC awarding itself big bonuses, manipulating the information, the performance indicators that if you were to look at first glance, say, oh, aren't they doing great? Yet they're manipulating it to look good at a time when by any objective measure, it can only be described as failing. So here we are. We have an example of that when it came to, despite the proud bilingual history of our country, what did CBC decide to do? They decided to outsource the dubbing of the French language over an English podcast to a company from Paris. It might have even been, similar time to maybe the CEO taking a taxpayer-funded supposed break from our holiday in Paris to go to the Olympics because she had to be there. Or the fact that the Liberals said yesterday at committee that being paid $500,000 to be proud of Canada is certainly worth it when it comes to those at the CBC. Yet we see how this record of failure and decline is what defines these Liberals. So the message is simple. Is it worth the cost? Well, to those French language artists in Quebec that could have gotten that contract, well, it seems like the CBC certainly didn't prioritize them. And now we've heard that they are, because of that mistake, they are now reversing that decision and going back at cost of taxpayers. So you have the problem with failure, Mr. Speaker, is it hurts everybody. So when it comes to the future of the CBC, I think Canadians are making it clearer and clearer every day. Simply, they are not worth the cost. It's time to reject the bonuses. It's time to fire that Prime Minister, and it's time to defund the CBC.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Conservative members that speak should qualify their introductory remarks by indicating very clearly that the leader of the Conservative Party for many years has wanted to defund CBC. Let's be very clear on that point. And then if you take a look at the most recent news article where you have Conservatives that are saying, and I would quote, "He's the only one who decides everything," and they're referring to the leader of the Conservative Party. This is what Conservative MPs are saying. He's the one who decides everything. His main advisor is himself. The people around him are only there to realize the leader's vision. His vision is to get rid of CBC, Mr. Speaker. And from my perspective, you know, institutions like CBC and CTV and Global play a very important role in our democratic system. Would the member not recognize that there is value to having a publicly supported CBC?
Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's interesting that that member would talk about control when they have to ask permission at caucus. They have to apply to be able to go up to the microphone to speak at their caucus. It is unbelievable the level of control and manipulation that that Prime Minister, those Liberals, have done to try and muzzle Parliament. You see, Mr. Speaker, here is the reality. That Prime Minister, those Liberals, they don't want an opposition. They don't want an opposition that opposes the agenda. They don't want an opposition that highlights their corruption and incompetence. They want an audience. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, we were elected as the opposition, and when we run in the next carbon tax election that hopefully comes soon, it will be Conservatives that present a vision for this country that will get this nation back on track.
Questions and comments? The Member for Timmins James Bay.
The issue of not worth the cost. The member who lives in the 19-room mansion at Stornoway, $94,000 to operate Stornoway, $170,000 in repairs. When he moved from his swanky digs in Ottawa to his super swanky digs, he dinged us $19,000 for...
Point of order, the Honourable Member for Fauché.
Yeah, the member's comments have absolutely nothing to do with the motion that's being debated.
There you go. The Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay. As much as that may be off, it's the questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you. I know it hurts when they actually have to look in the mirror. The $4,000 bill for April, May water, $7,506 for 2 months in July, August. Now here's the thing. He also has a private chef. So if they are serious about this, how about they forego the chef? Now, I know that forego is a complex word, so maybe we can put it into a bumper sticker. How about just F the chef and be accountable?
The Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
See, here you are, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting because that member and the NDP party as a whole is flip-flopping on their flip-flop that flopped and flipped. Because when it comes to the reality we have before them, they came out and said that they weren't a part of this coalition arrangement back in order to squeak out a by-election win in what used to be a safe seat for them. Then they flipped so that they would not call an election because they looked at the polls. And then they flopped again because they are now trying to pretend that they care about accountability. Yet just the other day, they said that they had come to this amazing agreement with the Liberals that now they have said that is no longer what they bargained for. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that when it comes to what's not worth the cost, it is that member and that leader of the fourth party in this place that need to look Canadians in the eye and justify why they keep that corrupt Prime Minister in power.
The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his speech. There are a few things in it that were quite interesting. However, there's a question that I have for him. He mentioned a number of times that the Conservatives are going to take power soon. But if that was the case, defunding the public broadcaster that also undertakes very important investigations for our democracy would be an error. So shouldn't the member be careful when talking about defunding CBC when we know that they do excellent investigative journalism?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it was interesting yesterday that even the President and CEO of CBC, Catherine Tate, and Liberal members acknowledged that Parliament brought into existence the public broadcaster, and Parliament can decide its future. And I think when it comes to why that's so important to highlight in this place is because we have an example where in our system, Parliament is supreme. Yet that Prime Minister and those Liberals are doing everything in their power to reject the role that this place has in preserving Canadian democracy. It's shameful, and anything other than a government needing to heed the will of this place, Mr. Speaker, is a constitutional crisis. Mr. Speaker, it is that Prime Minister and those Liberals that have normalized constitutional crises in this country, and it's time for better, and Conservatives will bring home better when we run in the next election, offer a common sense plan to Canadians, and we don't take for granted one single vote, Mr. Speaker. But when it comes down to it, Conservatives will offer a plan to Canadians, and Canadians get to choose.